it's really lovely to be here, and thanks to Pete and the Six Rivers Project for the invitation. So, as Pete mentioned, my name is Katrina. I'm a associate professor in conservation biology at the University of Oxford in zoology. I have to put this caveat up. So, as Pete mentioned, this is a new collaboration and it's sort of still under construction. So you're not going to hear the word salmon mentioned all that often during my talk because we haven't actually begun this work. But what I'm going to do today is focus on a slightly different aspect of the salmon conservation problem. So we've heard a lot about the ecological impacts of different management interventions, what's happening with stock, and I'm going to focus on the social side. What's the interaction of human communities with salmon populations? How do salmon conservation actions affect local communities? How do they experience the benefits and costs of these different actions? And I'll apologize, I've recently regained my throat, my voice after a bad cold. So if I dwindle into incomprehensibility, just grimace a little bit and I'll gradually pick up on it and I'll attempt to speak louder. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a new collaboration for us. It's also going to involve my colleague Michelle Jackson, who's going to be focusing on some of the marine work. So first, just in case anyone needed convincing, we think about the benefits and costs of different conservation activities and how they're experienced by society. And that's really important because although we may have limitless wants, we're in a closed system, we have limited energy and resources on this world available to us. And eventually that means that we have to make trade-offs in our choices. So while we might want to prioritize all conservation activities that could possibly have any positive impact on salmon populations, the reality is that we're going to have to pick and choose. And it's really important how we do that picking and choosing because we can't do everything. So if we pick the sort of lame ducks in our project pool, if we choose to back non-starters and we invest our limited conservation resources into projects which are going to achieve, might still achieve gains for populations or for biodiversity, but they won't achieve the greatest gains. The relative benefits and costs are not as high as they might be in other projects. So Kurt mentioned this, that some of the work they're doing is looking at how they can take lessons from different areas where salmon projects are going on. Mentioned that some of the work in the Fundy, the innovative Fundy, could have been prioritized earlier in time. And that's really important for us to know is, as researchers and to communicate back to policy, where should we be investing our resources in time and space? So this is some work that colleagues and I did looking at how we should be prioritizing protected areas. So if we have this perception that our business as usual approach has worked so far, or it's got some kind of inevitability behind it and we'll just proceed as we've been doing, we can really miss out on some of the benefits of investing resources to improve conservation outcomes. So the context for this is looking at protected areas. Protected areas are this global catchphrase. We think we should lock people out of natural areas in order to increase the level of environmental condition or benefits. We could do that to a greater or lesser extent. But if we're trying to protect, increase protection for different ecoregions around the world, what we looked at is if we follow a business as usual scenario and we're trying to reach some general conservation target, what we'll do is we'll miss out on protecting a lot of the key areas of biodiversity in the world that we might otherwise be able to protect. So in this strategy, we looked at if we wanted to protect 30% of all different ecoregions around the world by 2030, and we just changed our prioritization strategy slightly. If instead of proceeding as we've gone to date, we started saying, where are the areas which are closest to meeting our targets? Let's invest our resources there. We can double our ability to protect ecoregions around the world. So this is a plug for prioritization. Okay, so I'm coming back to conservation from a social perspective. Ultimately, we care about how human communities perceive the benefits and costs of conservation activities, how they experience those benefits and costs. And we do this for various reasons. Often in conservation, we're reliant on human communities. If we have a local fishing ground and we say you can't fish, we're reliant on those human communities not to fish. They have to comply with whatever legislation we've decided is important to protect the resource. One of the topics we also was discussed in yesterday's closing session was this concept of apathy towards, towards species which are declining at alarming rates. And what we really need to be doing, as again Kurt mentioned in his work, is engaging with our local communities and understanding how they value changes in environmental conditions, changes in their ability to see or fish for Atlantic salmon in their backyard. So we're interested in, for any given activity or conservation action, how are the benefits of those actions and how are the costs of those actions distributed across society? And this might be unequal. There might be sort of a resource concentration with some groups of society. There might be exclusion of others. I think I've forgotten the river, I apologize. So we can think of the indigenous Sami populations we have concerns that they might be excluded from some resources, other local resource users. It's important for us to understand how different groups in society are able to capture resources. So we've heard a lot over the last 2 days about the biological impacts of conservation activities. So we have some impacts on biodiversity conservation. We're improving a stock. We might be doing activities to improve habitat condition or improve the resilience of different ecosystems. So what we're seeing in economic terms is we're able to sort of group these benefits into market benefits and non-market benefits. And these are sort of catch terms that get bandied around by economists when we're talking about how we like to put everything in little boxes and put some kind of dollar sign next to it. But these values are important to us as policymakers or as researchers advising policy, because we need to know and understand how our activities are actually influencing society. If we're taking river away from power stations or we're from other social uses, then we need to understand the trade-offs imposed by those decisions. On the other hand, if we're thinking about conservation activities, usually there's going to be some kind of cost involved, and that cost will be borne by different actors. So private actors, the state, sort of civil society through conservation management groups. So we can have these sort of establishment costs. We've got the raw costs of some activity on the ground, the labor, the capital. But then we can also have these compliance costs. And so these will come down often to the resource users who were using the resource before some activity was generated or some investment was made. And it's important to understand what are the costs going to be for these local resource users. What's the cost to them of not fishing in their backyard? There's going to be some compliance costs there. There could be opportunity costs. Often when we're thinking of fishers, we've got some opportunity costs from establishing catch limits or from establishing a marine protected area. And we need to understand what those costs are to the local resource users. And then finally, there's been this discussion going through that we want our conservation actions to be sustainable in the long term. Pete mentioned we don't want projects that we spend great resources to establish and then 5 years later when the managing organization has sort of finished with a project, you don't want that great castle to sort of crumble into a heap because the funds have stopped. You want these processes to be self-generating. So coming back to our salmon, we spoke about these sort of direct and indirect ecological benefits. We have changes in the salmon stock, in the broader habitat that support them. Salmon is keystone indicators of the quality of our water, and we can make use of that through the Water Framework Directive and using salmon as a way to gauge the health of our ecosystems. We can also think of sort of more tangible benefits. We can think about employment and infrastructure in local communities, direct investment. The big one is obviously recreational fishing benefits. So from an economic perspective, what we're often interested in is understanding how people make trade-offs. So we're interested in understanding how much the local community values having changes or improvements in their local wildlife, their local salmon stocks, their local environment that supports salmon stocks, and what are they willing to give up in order to receive those benefits. It's useless to us as researchers to hear that the community values salmon stocks. The concept of value is meaningless unless a trade-off is forced to say you might value salmon stocks, but you probably also value health and education. So where do you want that relative investment to be made in order for us to understand how we should be allocating limited resources? So we come back to this concept of total economic value, which some of you may have heard of before. And what we're trying to capture in this big sort of concept, airy-fairy concept, I'll say, is this idea of we have these direct uses which society can touch and play with and have experience of. There are some more subtle values that we want to capture in our decision-making process. So we often come across one of these total economic value figures. What we're seeing is that as we progress from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, we have a sort of a decrease in tangibility. It's harder for resource users to understand the changes in their environment which are leading to these values. It's more difficult to value them. So we can think of direct use. We can think of, fishing in a stream. We can think of salmon consumption. Indirect use. And option value. Option value is this idea that I may not fish today, but I'd like to fish tomorrow. And I'd like to know that the salmon stocks are there, there's an environment where I can fish. Then we progress to these non-use values. And here we're thinking about how does the community value the ability to pass on a pristine environment where we have clean water, a healthy salmon stock for their future generations. Why is it important? Is it important that their children and their children's children will enjoy these resources as well? And we can think of existence value. So this concept that personally I may never visit some natural wonder in the world, but I like to know that it's there. I very much doubt that I'll see a wild panda in my lifetime, but it's nice to know that they exist somewhere in the world. Okay, so this concept of total economic value then comes down to as a sort of a catch-all to say we're generating different benefits and costs with our conservation activities, and we want to be able to capture that in some great metric which we can then report back to policymakers and say, if you're going to invest here instead of here, this is how we expect the distribution of costs and benefits across society. Okay, so as you might expect, assessing some of these benefits gets really difficult. So what we tend to do as economists is really hope that we can observe some transaction in a marketplace. So I can say you've just spent €1 for a bottle of water, therefore I assume that you have to value that bottle of water at least €1. Otherwise you wouldn't have given up €1 in order to achieve that bottle of water. It can be easy in the case of recreational fishing. We can say, how much have you spent to get to a lodge, for permits, for gear, for tackle, for travel? It can be more difficult for goods which we can't see and observe. So what did you pay to fish in an area with pristine water, with with a natural setting? So you've got woodlands on either side instead of a parking station or a garage. And what we often use in these situations is what we call revealed preference methods. So some of you may have come up against these before. A travel cost method. So what we're going to assume here is that the amount that I've paid to consume some recreational good is at least equal to how much I value that good. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent £1,000 on flight tickets. I wouldn't have spent £200 on accommodation. So I can assume that you value whatever you've gone to visit at least that much. Otherwise, you wouldn't have spent that money. So what we assume here is that the travel cost model basically says however much you've spent on each of these items gives me a representation of how much you value those items. So I can make, through this method, I can make comparisons between different sites with different characteristics. And I'll take you through that in some research that we've done in England. So this is Orval. It's a really large travel cost model developed for England and Wales by Brett Day at the University of Exeter. So Orval is a model of the value of green space in England and Wales. It's all the data is derived from this survey, which is done annually, the Monitor of Engagement with the Natural Environment, the MINI survey. There's about 50,000 respondents through the years that it was running. And it's now being put together as an online interactive tool, really similar to the tool that Colin was discussing, looking at the different data sources. You can interrogate it. So what we find in this particular travel cost model is that there are 3 key factors which really determine the value that different parts of society gain from visiting green spaces. So there's aspects of what the site is like. It's important to know the individuals who are actually visiting these sites, and it's also important to know, the availability of substitute groups. So in our case of salmon, we might value fishing for salmon slightly less if we can, or we can go for trout in a nearby stream and catch more or catch bigger individuals. So questions that we can answer using these models include how likely is an individual to make a trip, and then how much value does an individual derive from a trip. So in the case of green space in England and Wales, we can assess what's the impact of different parks. We can look at country parks, woods, allotments and cemeteries and nature areas. We can estimate the number of visits an average individual is likely to make each day to one of these parks. And we can see here that country parks are by far the most popular type of recreational green space in the UK. They generate almost £1 worth of value each day to the individuals who are visiting them. And in this way, this information becomes important for policymakers, because if they're deciding whether to preserve or restore or create new green spaces, they have an idea of how does the value to the public of these different green spaces change based on the site characteristics. And then importantly, should we be creating green spaces in areas which already have other substitute goods? So these additional data that I'm showing show you how that the value of a given site will change when you have a substitute good close by. So if you've got a sort of generic substitute of green space close by, how much does that affect the value for your sort of target green space area? Other elements that we can do with these travel cost models include understand how different characteristics of our individuals will affect the value of the resource that we're trying to understand. I apologize for the size of these figures. The key message from this is that dog owners, this will surprise all of you, get far more value out of green spaces in England and Wales than any other form of individual. So if you have a dog, then green spaces are much more valuable to you. It's the one defining characteristic across all of the different socioeconomic elements that we assessed. So that's that value in the top left-hand corner. So there's not much difference to green space value to people who have cars, who don't have cars. There's some interesting elements here that I'll draw parallels to. So I mentioned that different groups of society will experience the benefits and costs of conservation activities in different ways. And what we can do with these models is understand what's the value of green space to individuals in different socioeconomic categories. So individuals in our socioeconomic characteristics, which are characterized by higher incomes, by higher education levels, they actually get more value out of green space. They're more likely to visit green spaces. And we can think of a bunch of policy mechanisms or a bunch of reasons which might be explaining that. The availability of leisure time and all sorts of things, cultural attitudes towards green spaces. But effectively, unfortunately, white, wealthier, better educated people get more value out of green space than other groups of society. And that information is then useful for policymakers because we can think about, is this something that we want to intervene in? Is it culturally motivated? Is there a research problem here? Is there an equity problem here? It's more clean-cut when we look at the importance of car ownership, because then we can say, do we need a car park next to our green spaces in order to increase the value for the average respondent? Again, if we're thinking about the distance that people are traveling to visit our green spaces to receive these values, this may not surprise you in England and Wales, but it's very important to have green places close to space close to you. So parks and pathways and beaches are far more value if they're close by. So here we're seeing on the horizontal axis the distance of a park or a path. Park on the left-hand side and path on the right-hand side from an individual's home, and the value to them of a site in pounds per day on the vertical axis. So the dotted line indicates a sort of a 1 kilometre baseline, and parks which are closer than 1 kilometre generate much higher values to people. So people really appreciate having green spaces close to home. As soon as that green space gets further away, their likelihood of visiting that green space and the value they get from it falls off really steeply. We can come back to this idea of what the land cover types are really important in green spaces. So if we're thinking about parks, there's not much difference for the average individual if there's woodland or coniferous trees. On the other hand, if we're talking about paths, people really prefer woodland pasture areas to walk through. All these tiny little details about how people prefer sites to be composed when they're visiting green spaces in order to achieve this benefit becomes useful for us when we're thinking about designing conservation interventions, because it tells us something about how we should be designing these interventions. So if we're thinking about salmon conservation activities, we're thinking about revegetating areas because it provides water quality benefits, but it can also have an impact on the users of those, the human users of those areas as well. Okay, so this is our travel cost model, and these are our ability to infer value through sites, through sort of our ability to observe human behavior. We now move into a more nebulous realm, and we go into into stated preference. And so some work has been done in this area already. I'm about to butcher your name, sorry, Gundi, but by Gundi and other colleagues. Some work was done in the Scandinavian countries, so Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, no? So a really large sample to understand how do the Scandinavian community, how would they value a hypothetical improvement to recreational fishing activities. So this is a form of stated preference, and it involves a knock at your door or a survey being mailed to you in the post, or more recently now you get an email attachment and you have to click on the link and go through an online survey. And through this process of asking you questions about what your behavior would be under a hypothetical scenario, we can infer value for some environmental good. So this method in this paper is contingent valuation. It was used when Exxon Valdez crashed and spilled all its oil all over the coast of the US. It was the main survey instrument to justify litigation methods against Exxon Valdez. So how much should we be asking the company to pay to address this loss in habitat value and how that impacted the community? A different sort of method, which we tend to use more often these days, are called discrete choice experiments. So again, our point here is to say we have a hypothetical environmental good. There could be a salmon run in your backyard, or we could make some hypothetical change to the salmon run in your backyard. How do you value different aspects of that hypothetical change? What are the qualities and conditions which are most important to you? And we can think of this usually in marketing. You might be talking about a car. You might be saying, how important is it to the average consumer that it's 4 doors, that it has a boot, that it's got 4 wheels? 4 wheels, I think, is standard. If it's automatic, if it's a manual. And so we can watch how your willingness to pay, how much you're prepared to pay for the good in question changes as these attributes are changed. And then we can infer the value of marginal changes in each of these attributes based on those responses. So if we're thinking about salmon, we can think about willingness to pay for different changes in the size of our fish. And this is where the work that Olivia and the others from Imperial and Sami are doing, understanding how does the impact of our management interventions change the size of the fish which recreational fishers are able to catch? Does the recreational fishing experience really change materially based on the size of the fish caught? Maybe it's more important the quantity of fish caught, and understanding how recreational fishing users might value these changes in a system is really important for us when we're deciding how we should be. We've got an ecological objective to improve the benefits to the salmon stock, but we're also thinking about how these salmon stocks interact with human communities and how they experience these benefits. We can think about the environmental characteristics of a fishing site. So I mentioned water quality and vegetation. There's other environmental levers that we can pull, which will have an impact on how the community or recreational fishers value the experience they get. And similarly, we might be thinking, especially if we're doing local communities, it's important to understand how our conservation interventions are affecting other aspects of their life. So how is revenue from fishing reinvested in the community? Are there specific pathways that we can target which are more or less important to local resource users? So this is an example of what you might get in your mail, your survey that you've just clicked on in a link. I'm going to give you another example with some marine work that we did in Queensland. So in Queensland, we were interested in understanding how this area, Moreton Bay, if anyone's ever flown into Brisbane, remember those days when we could fly into Brisbane? Yeah, it's this big, beautiful crystal area just off the city, and it's a hotspot for every form of human activity. So there's major fishing, commercial fishery interests, there's tourism, there's mineral extraction, there's sand extraction. People just live there. People walk their dogs in this area. So understanding how the local community wants this marine area to be managed is really important for the policymakers. So this marine area was rezoned, fishing was cut back on, and this had major implications for commercial fishers, but also recreational fishers. It was thought that maybe this rezoning needed to be revisited, and what our objective was to understand how the community valued conservation or protection of different habitats within the bay. So if we were to say to our local community, are you more concerned about protecting habitats which support, large charismatic megafauna or smaller benthic, less charismatic species? What do you value as the community? So we distilled all of this complexity into various elements, and then we did a survey. We asked people to give us an idea of what their preference was for valuation of different marine habitats. And the importance of that was, let me skip through some of the detail here. Through various econometrics, I can tell you that the local community values protection of different marine habitats. Australian $1.8 for increase in the loose substrate habitats, and Australian $4.7 for increases in protection of hard substrates. So we can feed these dollar values, which make everyone a little bit nervous, but remember these are indicative policy signals. They're not designed to be taken at the written ledger. And we can use that to inform how we protect this area of Queensland, the marine area in Queensland, going forward. So going forward for us with Oxford and the Six Rivers project, we will have some PhD students starting, assuming that our research services team can be prevailed upon to come to an appropriate agreement. We then will be assessing the benefits of salmon conservation, and then Michelle will be looking at the drivers of salmon population declines, focusing on the marine stage. Grand. Apologies for inflicting you with my croaky voice, and thank you all very much.